Hello, doctors. I'm Dr. Chris Rapoff of QME Continuing Education, and welcome to this week's presentation. Today, I'd like to share a study with you that was initially conducted in 2018, but has many ramifications even today. Namely, are the rising medical costs that we see in workers' compensation today in 2024 just the price of doing business? Or are there other reasons for this? Namely, the medical fraud on behalf of the providers. The WCRB conducted a research study exploring that, and it was entitled The Impact of Medical Fraud Enforcement on California Workers' Compensation, and it uncovered many abuses by providers, and their findings produced indictments as a result. Let's take a look at the study. But first, these are the following sources that I referenced when producing this presentation. Feel free to copy and paste these links into your browser if you'd like to read more about the WCRB and particularly the subject of today's discussion. So a bit of background. Prior to the COVID pandemic of 2020, medical costs began declining in California workers' compensation system, and it was driven by a series of advisory pure premium rate decreases, totally approximately 40% of the WCRB's January 2019 pure premium rate filing. Now, much of this reduction in medical costs was driven by provisions of the Senate bill that we all know, of Senate Bill 863, including independent medical review, as well as subsequent legislation related to lien filing and other system components. Another significant factor is believed to be the efforts by the California Department of Insurance and the California Department of Industrial Relations, local district attorneys, and insurer-specific investigative units to identify and prosecute provider fraud. As of late 2018, which was the time of this analysis, more than 450 medical providers were indicted and or suspended by the DIR from practicing in California's workers' compensation system. Many of these providers previously billed and were paid significant amounts for workers' compensation-related services. While many of these procedures billed by these providers may have been for legitimate services, the suspension of these practices in California's workers' compensation is likely a significant driver of the reduced cost of the medical costs themselves. So for additional background, to help evaluate the impact of these anti-fraud efforts on the medical costs, the WCIRB assessed the volume and type of services rendered by the providers who were subsequently indicted and or suspended by DIR. Specifically, the WCIRB analyzed three things. First, what shares of the transactions and payments in the California's workers' compensation system were made to these indicted and or suspended providers? For these purposes, we will refer to them as indicted providers in this presentation. Now, did these shares change over time? Number two, what types of medical services did these indicted providers perform? Did the composition of these services change over time? And three, were there differences in payment lags and levels of activity among the indicted providers as compared to the other non-indicted providers? Well, let's take a look. The indicted providers identified in the WCIRB's medical transaction data included medical doctors, pharmacists and pharmacies, and other providers and entities such as chiropractors, suppliers of durable medical equipment, and hospitals. Approximately one-half of the indicted providers were medical doctors, and about one-third were pharmacists or pharmacies. And medical doctors accounted for 55% of the total medical payments to the indicted providers, while the pharmacists or pharmacies totaled only approximately 30% of those payments. I'm not sure you're ready for this, but the distribution of the indicted providers by the amount of money paid to them in the second half of 2012 through 2017 is what they investigated. Almost half of the providers received less than $100,000 in payments for medical services in this California's workers' compensation system. However, about 10% received more than $10 million in medical payments. Astounding. Now, the shares of the total medical payments in the paid transactions are as follows. Basically, all of the paid medical transactions and payments made to the indicted providers in 2012 and 2013, about 7% of the total medical payments were made to the indicted providers. However, the share began to drop sharply after the second half of 2013, which resulted in a decline of nearly 75% between the second half of 2012 and the second half of 2017. Over the same time frame, the percentage of paid transactions declined nearly 70%, from a 4.4% in the second half of 2012 to 1.4% in the second half of 2017. Could this be a result of the indictments? Who knows? They then took a look at the concentration of the payments to the indicted providers by the procedural type, which is very interesting. So at the time of this analysis, more than 450 medical providers were indicted and or suspended by the DIR from practicing in the workers' compensation system. A number of these providers billed and were paid significant amounts for workers' compensation-related services. So the WCIRB ranked the indicted providers by the total amount of payments made to them over the study period. And the top 10 providers accounted for nearly 60% of the lien payments made to all indicted providers and nearly half of the physician service payments. The top 25 received nearly 80% of both lien and pharmaceutical payments made to all of the indicted providers. Here we have the distribution of the medical payments for the physician services to the indicted providers by physician fee schedule component. They then examined the amount of the payments over time within each of these fee schedule components. While all components experienced a significant decrease in payments to the indicted providers, which we would expect, radiology showed the greatest percentage decrease, 92%. Yet evaluation and management had the smallest decrease of about 50%. Other providers experienced a 36% increase in medical payments for evaluation and management, and only a 32% decrease in radiology payments. So look at the difference between the indicted providers and the non-indicted providers in the percentages of change over time. They then studied the distribution of payments to the indicted providers by the physician's fee schedule component. And the share of the physician service payments to the indicted providers for evaluation and management services increased significantly over time, while the share of the payments for radiology, special services, and reports and surgery actually declined. Now, this is a troubling slide, but the payments in millions of dollars to the indicted providers by the pharmaceutical component is now established. And they summarize these patterns of the pharmaceutical payments. And the amount of payments over time within each category of pharmaceuticals was actually examined. And the components experienced a significant decrease in payments to the indicted providers, and Schedule II controlled substances showed the greatest percentage of decrease, while other pharmaceuticals, non-controlled substances that were generics, had the smallest percentage of decrease, 71%. Other providers experienced an 84% decrease in payments for Schedule II controlled substances, while payments for generic non-controlled substances declined by just 47%. Interesting, when we had the opioid epidemic issue coming to the forefront, I wonder if this had something to do with that as well. Now, the same with the pharmaceutical payments to the indicted providers. What was the distribution? Well, they discovered that approximately 20% of the pharmaceutical payments were made to the indicted providers for controlled substances, and the share stayed flat over time. Now, on the other hand, the share of the pharmaceutical payments for brand name drugs to the indicted providers dropped sharply in the second half of 15, but then leveled off in 2016. In conclusion, doctors, although this report is a bit dated, the WCIRB has indicated there's more to come. So I wanted to give you a baseline before we move forward. And in the beginning of this presentation, I asked everyone if the increase in cost of the workers' compensation in California was going to be just the price of doing business, or were there other nefarious reasons? Well, here, namely medical fraud on the behalf of the providers. Now, this study has revealed that that's actually both. So I do encourage you to take a look at this report and study it more in depth as we address other issues of fraud that this study uncovered and I didn't cover in this presentation. Finally, I ask that you stay tuned as they plan to release an update to this study, as the WCIRB has been monitoring the transactions and payments to those once indicted providers. Did they learn their lesson? We'll see. So, doctors, I'm Dr. Chris Rapoff, and I wanted to thank you for taking the time to join me in this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I do look forward to sharing some other interesting subjects as they relate to the topics involving workers' compensation in the state of California. Until next time, thank you.